The Galactic Council convened in the towering Assembly Hall, a monolithic structure of crystalline spires that reflected the harsh glow of a dying star. The air thrummed with the collective hum of over 100 species, each seated in their designated tiers, their expressions ranging from mild amusement to outright disdain. At the center of the chamber, a three-dimensional projection flickered to life, displaying grainy footage of human military exercises, massive wheeled cannons belching fire and smoke, their shells obliterating distant targets with a concussive force that sent shockwaves through the earth. High Admiral Zeltor of the Rilkarn Empire, a towering figure clad in ceremonial obsidian armor, leaned forward, his mandibles clicking in derision. This is the extent of human warfare. His voice, translated through the Council's linguistic matrix, carried an undercurrent of mockery. Chemical propellants, metal slugs, they may as well be throwing rocks. The assembled dignitaries erupted in laughter, the echoes bouncing off the chamber's vaulted ceilings. Seated along the periphery, a lone human delegate, little more than an observer in the grand proceedings, remained motionless. He had expected no less from the Council. For decades, humanity had been tolerated as a curiosity, a species that had clawed its way into interstellar relevance despite lacking energy weapons, shielded vessels, or quantum warfare capabilities. But tolerance did not equate to respect. Earth had remained a backwater world in the eyes of the Council, its fleets dismissed as relics in a galaxy of sleek war machines. Zeltor gestured toward the projection, where a howitzer shell arced through the sky before obliterating a reinforced bunker in a spectacular explosion. Charming, he said, but laughable. Our fleets are shielded. Our warships maneuver in three-dimensional space. What do humans think will happen when their primitive artillery meets our superior technology? A low murmur of agreement rippled through the Council. A diplomat from a Cellari Dominion, a serpentine species with bioluminescent scales, flicked its tail against the polished floor. Perhaps they should be made an example of, it mused. A minor skirmish. Teach them their place. The murmurs grew louder. Talks of punitive action, of strategic containment, of demonstrating to humanity that its expansion had limits. The discussion shifted from ridicule to something far more dangerous. On a secure military station concealed within the Kuiper Belt, Colonel James Jim Grayson watched the live feed from a classified intelligence uplink. The laughter, the dismissive tones, the way the Council debated Earth's future without the slightest regard for its people. His knuckles tightened around the edge of the console, the blue light from the projection casting hard shadows across his face. Behind him, Captain Samuel Harlow exhaled through his nose, arms crossed over his chest. "They've already decided," he muttered. "They'll come for us." Grayson said nothing. He didn't need to. The room was silent save for the distant hum of the station systems, the weight of inevitability pressing down on all of them. Major Patrick Hayes, an Air Force strategist with a sharp mind for battlefield logistics, leaned against the bulkhead, eyes narrowed. "We don't have the fleets to meet them head-on," he said. "Not in open space. Our ships are tough, but they weren't built for shield warfare. They'll tear through us before we can land a solid hit." Sergeant Diego Morales, a Marine heavy weapons specialist, cracked his knuckles. "Then we make sure they don't see us coming." Grayson turned away from the feed, his expression unreadable. "We're not winning this fight by playing their game. Shields and plasma won't save us. But maybe, just maybe, an old trick will." The team exchanged glances. They had been pulled together from across the branches of the military, each an expert in their respective fields, each handpicked for their ability to adapt under pressure. And if Grayson had called them here, it meant he already had a plan. Harlow rubbed a hand along his jaw. "You're thinking artillery." Grayson nodded once. "I'm thinking artillery." Hayes exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Jim, if we're talking about deploying howitzers in space, there's 100 reasons why that shouldn't work." "But one reason why it will," Grayson countered. "They rely on shields. Shields that deflect energy-based attacks, disperse heat, and absorb plasma. You know what they don't stop? Kinetic force. A slug moving at the right velocity doesn't get deflected, it punches through. And it doesn't stop punching. Morales grinned. So we're going to teach them what happens when you bring shields to a gunfight. Harlow whistled low. We'd have to modify them. Counter recoil. Adapt trajectory control for vacuum conditions. Hayes rubbed his temples. And what about maneuverability? We can't just drop artillery pieces into space and hope for the best. We won't, Grayson said. We mount them. Stealth carriers. Fire from beyond their sensor range. We use debris fields, asteroid clusters, places they won't expect heavy ordnance to be deployed. The room fell into silence as the weight of the plan settled in. It was absurd. It was risky. And if it worked, it would be the most audacious military maneuver in human history. Morales cracked his knuckles again, this time in anticipation. Well, hell, he said. I always wanted to see what happens when you fire a howitzer in 0G. Harlow exhaled, shaking his head with a half-smile. They think we're a joke. Let's make sure they remember the punchline. Grayson's gaze returned to the projection, where Zell-Tor stood triumphant before the council, already planning Earth's downfall. The laughter still echoed in his mind. They wouldn't be laughing for long. The hangar bay of the Kuiper Belt station vibrated with the rhythmic thrum of heavy machinery, a symphony of controlled chaos, as engineers and weapons specialists worked to repurpose an outdated war machine for the deadliest battlefield known to man, deep space. The M777 howitzer, a relic of Earth's past conflicts, stood in the center of the bay, its reinforced titanium frame surrounded by diagnostic cables, modified stabilizers, and modular thruster attachments. It had been designed for terrestrial combat, built to launch high-explosive shells across vast distances with pinpoint accuracy. Now it would fire in the void against an enemy that believed kinetic weaponry had no place in the future of warfare. Colonel James Grayson stood near the edge of the workstation, arms folded, gaze sharp. He watched as Captain Samuel Harlow crouched beside the artillery piece, running calculations on his tablet. Numbers and trajectory models scrolled across the screen, adjusting for 0G conditions, compensating for the lack of atmosphere, the absence of traditional recoil dampening. Every equation confirmed the same thing. What they were attempting had never been done before. "This is insane," Major Patrick Hayes muttered, pacing near the control panel. His voice carried a mix of skepticism and reluctant admiration. "You're asking a ground-based artillery system to function in a vacuum. Recoil's going to send it spinning like a dam top." "That's why we stabilize it," Grayson countered. "Use the recoil to our advantage. Let it push against mounted thrusters, keep it locked in position." Hayes exhaled through his nose, glancing at the mess of equations. "And if the shells don't hold trajectory? If we miss?" Harlow didn't look up. "Then we adjust until we don't." Sergeant Diego Morales grinned as he inspected the loading mechanism, checking the modified shells lined up in the reinforced magazine. "Ain't much room for if in a fight," he said. "They're coming whether this works or not." Morales had spent years in combat zones where precision was the difference between life and death. Now, that same principle applied on a scale no human soldier had ever faced before. The enemy had the advantage in ship-to-ship combat. Plasma cannons, energy torpedoes, directed particle beams, every weapon in their arsenal was designed for fleet engagements, for skirmishes fought at the speed of light. But none of that mattered if their ships weren't built to withstand the sheer, unrelenting force of kinetic bombardment. Grayson tapped a command into his wrist console, bringing up a holographic projection of their first planned engagement zone. An asteroid belt beyond Neptune, thick with debris, a perfect natural cover. We move the platform into position, mask it against the surrounding rock formations. The stealth carriers keep a low-energy signature. Let them think it's just another cluster of junk. Harlow nodded. No active targeting systems, no high-energy emissions. By the time they realize something's off, we'll have already fired. Hayes leaned over the console, running a hand along his jaw. "And you're sure the rounds will punch through their shields?" Grayson's gaze was unwavering. "At the speeds we're talking?" A direct hit won't just breach, it'll turn their ships inside out. Morales smirked. Now, that's what I like to hear. They had studied the alien fleet's engagements, analyzed every recorded battle from skirmishes against lesser species to full-scale planetary sieges. Shields could deflect energy, absorb heat, disperse radiation. But they weren't designed to counteract the brute force of hypervelocity projectiles. The howitzers wouldn't fire like they had on Earth. These rounds wouldn't arc. They would be magnetically accelerated, adjusted mid-flight by microthrusters, guided by calculations so precise that a single miscalculation could send the entire barrage into empty space. There was no margin for error. Grayson turned to the engineers, making final adjustments to the firing mechanisms. "Give me a status check." A technician wiped sweat from his brow. Mounting thrusters are calibrated. Stabilizers holding. Targeting assist is running passive tracking. First test round is ready for live fire. The room stilled. This was the moment. No simulation, no theoretical discussions, just raw execution. Grayson stepped back. Fire. Morales moved to the control panel, inputting launch coordinates. The howitzers barrel adjusted, locking onto a designated test target, an old decommissioned mining rig floating several hundred kilometers away. A green light flickered on the interface. Morales pressed the trigger. The howitzer's chamber ignited, the kinetic round launching forward with devastating force. The recoil thrusters fired simultaneously, keeping the weapon steady, as the shell rocketed through the void at impossible speeds. There was no sound, no thunderous blast, just the faintest ripple in the distant stars as the projectile crossed the vast emptiness. Less than a second later, the mining rig exploded into a violent spray of molten debris. The silence in the hangar was absolute. Harlow exhaled slowly. Well, that worked. Hayes ran the numbers on his screen, eyes scanning the data. Direct hit. Impact velocity. Jesus. That thing tore through reinforced plating like it wasn't even there. Grayson's jaw tightened. Now imagine that against their fleet. Morales clapped his hands together. "Oh, I'm imagining, boss." Harlow pulled up trajectory models for moving targets. "We'll need to account for ship evasions. If they pick up any of these rounds mid-flight, they'll start dodging." Hayes nodded. "Then we stagger fire. Set up overlapping kill zones. If they dodge one, they fly straight into another." Grayson looked at his team, men who had fought their whole lives in wars where humanity had always been outgunned, always forced to improvise, to adapt. Now they were about to rewrite the rules of space warfare. "We deploy in 12 hours, he said. "Prep the stealth carriers. Load every round we've got." Harlow arched an eyebrow. "No second test." Grayson's expression was cold. "No need." Hayes smirked, shutting off his console. "Then let's go show them what happens when you laugh at old weapons." Morales grinned. "Oh, they ain't laughing after this." The void stretched endlessly, a canvas of darkness speckled with distant stars, cold and indifferent. Nestled within the asteroid belt beyond Neptune, the human strike force lay, in absolute silence, concealed among the floating debris. The modified howitzers, now mounted on stealth carriers, remained dormant, their presence hidden from enemy sensors. The plan was simple: wait, strike, disappear. There would be no drawn-out battle, no desperate struggle for survival. There would be only devastation, delivered without warning. Colonel James Grayson stood on the bridge of the lead carrier, watching the tactical display with unblinking focus. The Galactic Council's fleet had arrived. The sensor readouts confirmed their numbers, 12 capital ships, flanked by a dozen smaller escorts. A force designed to overwhelm, not just intimidate. They had come expecting submission, expecting a show of force that would break Earth's will. They had no idea they were stepping into a kill box. Captain Samuel Harlow stood beside him, arms crossed, studying the fleet's formation. They're running standard patrol sweeps, not even bothering with full combat readiness. "They think we're not a threat," Grayson replied, his voice devoid of emotion. Major Patrick Hayes leaned against the console, eyes scanning the movement patterns. Their command ship is sitting dead center. Typical. They assume no one's bold enough to take the shot. Sergeant Diego Morales tapped the firing console, a slow grin creeping across his face. Then let's be bold. Grayson exhaled slowly, calculating the perfect moment. The fleet was spreading out, creating a net around the sector, confident in their superiority. The Howitzers had remained cold, no heat signatures, no energy emissions. Just inert metal, hidden in the debris field. The enemy would detect nothing until it was too late. The order came without hesitation. Fire. A mechanical whine filled the launch bay as the Howitzers activated, their chambers cycling with brutal efficiency. The first volley launched into the void, solid tungsten shells, accelerated to unfathomable speeds, invisible to traditional sensors. There were no energy bursts to intercept, no telltale launch signatures to track. Just silent death, moving faster than thought. The impact was immediate. The first enemy cruiser shuddered violently as a kinetic round punched through its hull, bypassing shields as if they were nothing. A second round struck an escort frigate, tearing straight through its command deck and out the other side. There was no explosion at first, just the eerie sight of metal rupturing in complete silence. Then came the delayed eruptions, oxygen igniting, internal compartments collapsing. The Galactic Council's fleet had never encountered anything like it. Panic spread through their formation. Alien officers scrambled to make sense of the attack, issuing frantic orders, redirecting shield power, searching for an enemy they could not see. Their mistake was trying to find energy-based signatures, trying to track a battle by the rules they understood. But there was nothing to trace. Just more rounds, more silent destruction. Another impact caved in the engine bay of a destroyer, sending it spiraling into the wreckage of its own comrades. On the human command deck, Hayes let out a low whistle. They don't even know where to shoot. Harlow nodded. They were expecting light-speed weapons. Not physics. Morales grinned. Physics don't give a damn about shields. The enemy fleet scattered, their captains abandoning formation in a desperate bid to escape the unseen barrage. It was a mistake. Their own evasive maneuvers put them directly into the kill zones. Grayson's team had planned for this, calculating the exact routes the enemy would take once they panicked. The second volley was already in motion before the first targets had even been struck. The Galactic Council's flagship, a behemoth of reinforced plating and layered shielding, took a direct hit to its command tower. The round didn't just breach, it cored through the entire structure, sending fractured debris spiraling into the abyss. What was once a vessel of authority and fear was now a drifting hulk, its crew reduced to scattered atoms. Harlow exhaled. Flagships down. Morales chuckled. 12 capital ships, and not a single one figured out what hit M. Grayson's gaze remained cold. We're not done. The surviving alien warships, battered and broken, abandoned their offensive posture entirely. Thrusters flared as they turned, accelerating away from the battlefield in full retreat. There was no pride, no final stand. Their overwhelming force had been reduced to nothing in minutes. Hayes leaned back. They're running. Grayson's voice was like steel. Let them. No pursuit was necessary. The message had been sent. The Galactic Council had laughed at old human weaponry, mocked the primitive nature of their warfare. Now they fled, their technological arrogance shattered. Morales smirked. Bet they're not laughing anymore. Harlow glanced at the debris field, at the ruined husks of what had once been a fleet designed to subjugate an entire planet. No, they're terrified. Grayson's eyes remained locked on the retreating ships, his expression unreadable. This had not been just a battle. This had been a warning, and the galaxy had heard it loud and clear. The wreckage drifted in the silent void, the shattered remains of what had once been an unstoppable armada. Flames flickered in the vacuum, short-lived bursts of oxygen escaping from torn hulls before being extinguished by the cold emptiness of space. Twisted metal spun aimlessly, the remnants of warships that had once stood as symbols of galactic dominance. Now they were nothing more than debris, testaments to the brutal efficiency of kinetic destruction. The Galactic Council's fleet had come expecting an easy victory. Instead, they had been introduced to the raw, merciless reality of human warfare. Colonel James Grayson stood on the bridge of the lead carrier, watching the aftermath unfold through the observation panel. The enemy survivors had scattered, their fractured formations vanishing into the darkness, fleeing toward the nearest Council-controlled sector. There was no doubt they would report what had happened. No doubt they would try to make sense of how their superior fleet had been reduced to nothing in minutes. But understanding wouldn't save them. Their technology had failed them. Their arrogance had doomed them. And the war they thought they could wage with impunity had just changed forever. Captain Samuel Harlow tapped a command into his console, analyzing the data feeds streaming in from the battlefield. Every shot had landed within a margin of error, so small it barely registered. The modified Howitzers had performed beyond expectation, their kinetic rounds striking with such precision that the enemy hadn't even been able to formulate a counterattack. The ships that had survived had done so not because of strategy, but because they had been lucky enough not to be in the direct line of fire. They didn't even try to fire back, Harlow muttered, his voice carrying the weight of disbelief. Not effectively. Not in any way that mattered. They weren't trained for this, Major Patrick Hayes said, still staring at the scattered remains of the Council fleet on the tactical display. They've spent their entire existence fighting wars the way their technology dictated, energy-based weapons, shielded defenses, engagements fought at long range with predictable trajectories. They thought they understood combat, Sergeant Diego Morales added, a grim smirk playing on his lips. Turns out, they don't know a damn thing about it. Grayson remained silent, his expression unreadable. He had known this would work. Known, in theory, that kinetic weapons could break the foundation of the enemy's military doctrine. But even he hadn't expected it to be this absolute. The enemy hadn't even been given the chance to fight. They had been slaughtered before they realized they were in a battle. The message is clear, Harlow said, locking eyes with Grayson. They wanted to make an example of us. Instead, we made an example of them. Hayes exhaled sharply. The Council isn't going to take this lightly. They'll come back. With more ships. With countermeasures. Grayson turned from the viewport, his voice calm but edged with certainty. Let them. The battlefield had been chosen carefully, a remote sector, isolated from civilian populations, a place where the engagement could be decisive without collateral damage. But that luxury wouldn't exist in the next battle. The Council would return with vengeance, with numbers, with desperation. They wouldn't understand how they had lost, but they would seek to overwhelm, to drown Earth in sheer force. That was the way of empires. When power was challenged, the response was always to escalate. They won't just send warships next time, Harlow said. They'll blockade supply lines, cut off trade, target colonies. They'll turn this into a war of attrition. They don't know how to fight that kind of war, Hayes countered. They think in terms of dominance, not survival. Morales cracked his knuckles, grinning. And survival is where we thrive. The Galactic Council had made the same mistake that every empire in history had made when facing a force they didn't understand. They had assumed that technological superiority meant military invincibility. But technology alone didn't win wars. Tactics did. Strategy did. The ability to adapt, to change, to turn disadvantages into strengths, that was what had made humanity resilient. That was why Earth had always endured no matter the odds. Grayson looked at his men, a team of hardened warriors who had just rewritten the rules of space combat with nothing more than old artillery and human ingenuity. The war wasn't over. It had barely begun. But now it was being fought on humanity's terms. No transmissions, he ordered. No public statements. We don't announce our victory. We let the silence do the talking. Harlow nodded, understanding the intent. The Council's own fleet had witnessed their failure. The surviving ships would carry the truth back to their leaders. And that truth would spread faster than any official declaration. They'll try to explain this away, Hayes said. Blame a fluke, a malfunction, something to save face. Grayson's eyes were cold. Until it happens again. Morales chuckled. Damn right it will. The humans didn't need to chase the enemy. They didn't need to seek out new battles. The Council would bring the fight to them, believing that they still had the upper hand. And when they did, they would meet the same fate as the fleet that now drifted as lifeless wreckage. Harlow shut down the targeting interface, his voice carrying a quiet certainty. This is the beginning of something bigger. Grayson nodded. And we're ready for it. The enemy had learned a lesson today. They had learned that humanity was not weak. That Earth was not to be conquered. That old weapons in the right hands could break the foundations of an empire. And next time, there would be no retreat, only war.